It is right that we should want a majority of the people in Britain to be of British cultural background. I think that is that shouldn't be controversial. We should be able to say that. And if I'm not allowed to say that, then I think if people like me are demonized for saying that, then I think you will end up in a very, very dangerous place indeed.
I would rather have less state power and less, Windrush Generation 2.0 of deporting people who, you know, we're talking about liberty and individualism here.
Mm.
That's such an infringement on their right to just live a free and happy life.
Bear in mind, about 50% of all social housing in London, social housing created by those who believed in Attlee's vision of a welfare state, about 50% of that housing is now occupied by foreign-born people. I think that's a grave betrayal of the British working class, that we've allowed half of that social housing in our capital city to house people who come into the West, often with the intention of living at public expense in the West. I mean, if I was on the left and I was passionately pro-immigration, or rather stridently people who are anti-immigration on the right, as I would see it, I would kind of listen to what Carswell says, precisely because I'm someone who's changed their view about immigration. Back when I joined UKIP in 2014, 2015, I had a bit of a falling out with some in UKIP over the issue of immigration, because I tended to be what you might call more liberal on immigration than most people in UKIP. And I was prepared to argue that. In fact, I wrote an op-ed in the Times saying that Enoch Powell had been wrong. I was an optimist about immigration. I think I was misguided and mistaken, and I think I was wrong, and I think the people in UKIP who criticized me at the time for being wrong were correct. Why? I believed, for a start, I don't think there's ever a problem with too many people. I think having lots of people actually allows you, if you get everything else right, to create more wealth. I don't have much truck with the idea that, you should cap the number of people in a country. And, I think population growth is a good thing. And we're about to discover the hard way that a population decline is a very bad thing. But I've changed my mind about immigration, and I've become vehemently anti largely non-Western immigration into the West for a number of reasons. First of all, I just no longer believe that all people are the same. I don't believe they're interchangeable. For the old model to work, you had to assume that people coming into a country would have a very similar set of values after a period of time. They would integrate, they would assimilate, and they would become essentially indistinguishable from the host country. It's becoming clear to me that just simply isn't the case. People aren't interchangeable. And not only that, not only are people coming into the West not assimilating, they are actually establishing parallel communities that are diverging and that have no intention of converging. They never will converge. Part of the reason why we have been blindsided by this is partly because I think we've underestimated three things. Number one, that the number of immigrants coming in. Until 1997, the number of people coming into Britain every year was, relatively few. It was tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands or 250,000 per year, or whatever it is, 500,000 a year that it is now. The numbers were relatively small. So the speed and pace of immigration was relatively low. And while most of the people coming in tended to be from places like Poland or Italy or Spain, the cultural gap was not that far. They were essentially Western. And I think this is a really important conversation to have. It's not about race. It's not about the color of people's skins. It's not about their culinary preferences. It's about a frame of mind. Western people tend to think differently. Now, if you take exception to that, I would suggest there's a book you read called Weird, The Weirdest People by Joseph Henrich. And he talks about distinctive psychological traits that people in the West have: a commitment to individualism, a whole series of character traits. I would argue that part of that are productive time preferences. These are very real differences between peoples. And if you allow large numbers of people into the West without a Western mindset, very rapidly, large numbers of people, and you don't compel them to integrate and assimilate, you have no chance of creating a cohesive society. I haven't even mentioned the I word, Islam. I don't think you need to have a conversation about immigration to understand that actually it is not good for the West and it is not good for immigrants to the West unless you restrict the numbers, unless you control immigration, unless you're incredibly selective over who you let in, and you place absolute requirements for certain forms of conduct for migrants coming in. Number one, it should be absolutely understood that you integrate by speaking English. It should be absolutely understood that if, unless you fall ill or you retire, if you become dependent upon the welfare system in the Western country, you should leave. Unless we do this, we're heading towards a disaster. We've basically got a welfare system that people from third world countries are taking advantage of and becoming welfare dependents in the West, taking advantage of that system. If we're not careful, it's not just going to destroy the welfare system in the West, it's going to destroy any notion of all people being equal or equality under the law or social cohesion. We're seeing that in real time. And yet when people talk about it, they're demonized to the point where the only man in the country in Britain who seems willing to talk about it is Tommy Robinson. I think unless we have an honest conversation about, cultural coherence. Katie Lamb got demonized the other day for talking about cultural coherence, cultural compatibility. Unless you listen to Katie Lamb and you listen to her calmly and rationally and you let her have her say, the only other voice you're going to hear is Tommy Robinson. Do you want to go there? This issue isn't going to go away. Times columnists are not going to close down the debate. This debate is coming. This debate is now. I think we need to have an honest conversation. An Eritrean is not going to become an Englishman. An Eritrean, I don't think, can ever become an Englishman. And I think we need to understand that we need an immigration system that takes that into account. That's not to say that everyone from Eritrea cannot live in the West, but it is to be realistic about who we let in. And it is to be realistic about the fact that in Britain, it is right that we should want a majority of the people in Britain to be of British cultural background. I think that is that shouldn't be controversial. We should be able to say that. And if I'm not allowed to say that, then I think if people like me are demonized for saying that, then I think you will end up in a very, very dangerous place indeed.
Just before that I offer my insights on it, I just wanted to clear up. You're obviously warning against the likes of Tommy Robinson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not a favor of street protests. There's never been a morally good mob in human history. It's an extraordinary position where on some of the big issues of the day, Tommy Robinson is making podcasts that have more moral authority than the utterance of every bishop of the Church of England on this issue in 5 or 10 years. There's been a complete lack of leadership, and the baton has been handed to someone that I don't think you want leading on this.
Yes, that was basically the question answered there, because I think Tommy Robinson is a very unsavory individual who we don't want any sort of leadership from. That is where.
But having said that, I'm not going to join in I'm not going to play the Times columnist game of I'm not going to sit here and denounce Tommy Robinson. I'm absolutely not going to do that, because then we all say, oh, he's bad. But no. Until I hear a mainstream politician addressing the issue of cultural compatibility, accepting that we have had too many people from culturally incompatible countries come into the West, and that it is absolutely right that I should be able to argue and want and vote for a government policy that means that British culture is the majority culture in Britain. Until I can do that, I'm not gonna have a dig at Tommy Robinson.
I think you can obviously have a dig at him without having to give up your belief system, because I think on the whole he is not a person that I would want any sort of association with. His even his criminal history and what he has partaken in is very questionable. But in terms of, so there's a lot to unpack there, what you
Mhm.
have said. And I think some of the things that you have said are sensible. You look at other nations around the
Mhm.
world, Australia
Mhm.
with their point system for immigration, it just makes sense. The parts that, and you haven't mentioned it, so I do have to ask about it,
Mhm.
is the re-immigration scheme that you've
Mhm.
kind of proposed.
Mhm.
But also, I guess, and as somebody who is libertarian,
Mhm.
having the idea of, I'm trying to think of a way to correctly describe it because again, I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Mhm.
Um, People of, I guess, certain backgrounds who you're kind of vetting to come into the country now with the
Mhm.
safety aspect and things like that.
Mhm.
But what does an immigration system look like then that is not
Mhm.
big state, that is not controlling
Yeah.
people or
This is a problem for libertarians like me because
yes,
a libertarian like me reads Ayn Rand in his 20s and thinks, ah, great, we've got this wonderful template.
yes.
You then grow up and you suddenly realize that actually libertarianism is based upon the idea of individualism.
Hmm.
But not all people have the same idea of individualism. Individualism is a very Western concept. I would say that actually, probably the Jewish idea of each of us being created in the image of God. Well, you
Hmm.
don't have to be religious. In fact, secular Western people have, without realizing it, absorbed this essentially Jewish Christian idea of each person being imbued with dignity. And I think it's a miraculous
Hmm.
innovation in thought that is the basis of civilization. I think it's wonderful. In its secular form, it gives rise to the concept that each of us has natural rights. In the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, by which Jefferson meant all people are created equal. We sort of take this for granted, rather like a fish surrounded by water. It's all around us, so we don't really see it. Most people who live on the planet don't come from societies that think like that. They just don't. They are often clan based. They often have an affiliation to ethnicity. They tend not to. I mean, look at some of the features that we have in our society. Take, for example, the Dragon's Den or the Y Combinator, where you have complete strangers appearing in front of a group of other strangers and making a business pitch for them to invest money. That, that is a very Western idea that you you assess someone purely on the basis of their business idea and give them money purely on the basis of trust and contract. Many countries around the world simply couldn't have a Dragon's Den type scenario because people aren't judged as individuals in the marketplace or socially or in all sorts of ways. Um, and and perhaps we in the West just don't see this because we don't know much about the world beyond the West. And when we do travel to the world beyond the West, we stay in the same kind of Marriott hotels and talk to people from those countries with MBAs, and we just don't see the differences. But the differences are there and the differences are real. As a libertarian, I would love it if everyone had the same idea about individualism that the West has, but they don't. So I think we need to think of ourselves as being in a walled garden. And I think the state needs to maintain that wall. Literally, it needs borders. It needs to keep people out who don't have that adherence to those Western values. I came up with a quite detailed set of proposals for an incoming administration to implement. It was a series called Milestones. The Telegraph ran it. Um, in a nutshell,
It's on your Substack, isn't it?
yeah, it's
The
on my
nine
Substack.
milestones. Yes.
Yeah, it's on my Substack. I think it's one of the Telegraph's most widely read articles this year. They did a wonderful job. They published all 9,000 words of it. Scroll down to the end if you want to read the bit about immigration. I mean, you need to do a number of things. You need, I think, to deport people who are in the country illegally. That goes without saying. And to do that, you would need certain judicial reform to stop the judges perennially thwarting that. But assuming you've done all that, I I then advocate a public benefit test. Just because you've come into the country legally, it doesn't mean you have an entitlement to stay there. If I was, as an immigrant to America, now living on welfare in America, I would lose my legal residency, and quite rightly, or I should do. Pre-Trump, I wouldn't have. Post-Trump, I certainly would. It's quite right. If I'm a non-American citizen living in America at public expense, yes, I've got a jolly good explanation as to why I should leave. And we need to apply that. So I recommend a public benefit test. Bear in mind, about 50% of all social housing in London social housing created by those who believed in Attlee's vision of a welfare state. About 50% of that housing is now occupied by foreign-born people. Um, I think that's a grave betrayal of the British working class, that we've allowed half of that social housing in our capital city to house people who come into the West, often with the intention of living at public expense in the West. I think if you believe in championing the British working class, you would see that as wrong, and you would support the idea of a public benefit test. But the Labour Party that is supposedly in favour of defending that working class has actually, I think, betrayed them. And this is why I think the working class in Britain are shifting politically to alternatives. A public benefit test, I think, should be applied to people who are lawfully in the country but non-UK residents. I then think you need to very selectively apply tests that would allow you to remove citizenship from people, even if they've been born in the UK, who espouse ideas that are incompatible with being a citizen in the West. Now, I don't think you need to do this at scale. I think you need to do it selectively, but I think you need to do it. I think there are imams in mosques. I think there are Islamists born in the UK, maybe second, third generation. In terms of legal status, they're no different from you or me. But the British state needs, like it did in the Begum case, the ability to remove citizenship from someone and then remove them from the country. We've got to get over this idea that just because someone has been born in the country, they are entitled to espouse values. And one of the key criteria, what are the criteria by which you should be removed? Well, I believe in religious liberty. I believe in it very, very strongly. I actually think one of the wonderful things about America's founding is George Washington's letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport, where he basically says to them in the new fledgling republic that you don't need my permission as the strong man in America to pursue religion. You're free to worship who you want. It's a wonderful letter that he wrote to them. I believe very strongly in religious liberty, but religious liberty doesn't just mean allowing people who are Muslims to be Muslims. It means Muslims allowing Muslims who renounce their faith to renounce their faith and not come to any harm. We know that most, if not all, orthodox views of Islam teach that apostates, as they call them, should be killed. I think people who advocate for harm to apostates that should be one of the key criteria. If you are advocating for harm to apostates in Britain, I think that should be the basis for you to lose your citizenship and to be removed from the country. I think it will happen, incidentally. I can't help noticing that whenever there's a terror attack, we're told that it's a one-off, and yet it's another terror attack. Often the circumstances seem remarkably similar to previous terror attacks. I can't ever remember ever hearing the state seriously investigating what mosques the perpetrator went to, what imam they listened to. We're going to have these conversations.
There's a lot to unpack there, Douglas, but for me, the libertarian alarm bells are ringing because it's a very, it seems to me, again, you might have mapped this out, but cultural incompatibility, which you're explaining about, seems a very loose term. And it also seems to hand the government, which we've discussed that extensively, big government is a terrible thing. It's basically allowing big government to decide whether you are a desirable citizen or not if you agree with so-called cultural compatibility. And
well, this is what I mean by cultural incompatibility. My model of a free society in which people are autonomous is incompatible with Islamism. You cannot. This is the tragedy of it. You cannot. I read Ayn Rand at the same time that I was reading Syed Qutb, one of the founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood's book Milestones. The two systems are incompatible, and you will have to have a Hobbesian state step in there. Ultimately, if you have more Manchester Arena type scenarios, people will demand a Hobbesian state response. And as a libertarian, I don't like that, but it's, Hobbes came before Locke for a reason.
Well, my question would be, where does it stop then? Because first of all, it will be cultural incompatibility, but then could it be the slippery slope of, well, you're a murderer or a rapist? Well, people be on side
mm,
with that, then,
mm,
well, you're a
mm,
shoplifter or
mm,
you've stolen somebody's car
mm. Yeah.
and maybe the context isn't looked into. To me, that ushers
Mm,
in a real
mm,
danger of then what becomes
mm,
culturally incompatible? Is it
mm,
questioning the
mm. Yeah.
government then?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and if
Mm,
this ideology, you know, at the moment,
yeah.
if again in this utopian scenario, I've heard you say many times that you wouldn't want to be prime minister in charge. So you know, you've got Douglas Carswell's top choice. But what
Mm.
happens after your choice leaves office and then somebody like Keir Starmer comes in?
It's a very, very good point. I mean, you don't need to argue this in the abstract. I mean, when I was an MP, I often heard people talking about anti-terror measures, and we all nodded along sagely. And yet,
Exactly,
under the
yes.
auspices of anti-terror measures, travelers are stopped at airports and they're told they have to open up their iPhones and account for what's on their Twitter feeds,
Yes.
all using anti-terror legislation. You're absolutely right. Um, and I think that's a intellectually very coherent and morally very coherent critique of what I'm advocating for.
Because
But
I think
what else? How many more atrocities
mm,
will it take before the state recognizes that it needs to act? I mean, it's there will be action because the social fragmentation and the terror threat will eventually trigger the demand for action. The security approach put forward by the British administrative state since Charles Farr has been pretty disastrous. It's not really got to the root of the problem. It seems to be more intent on managing perceptions of the indigenous population than dealing with the actual problems. Paul Goodman wrote a very, very good article in the Telegraph about this recently. There are no good solutions to this. You're right, Jason. There are no good solutions to this. But we will, I think, end up sooner rather than later in a situation in which the state needs to remove many of the 40,000 people in Britain who are Islamists on the terror watch list. It's not going to be pretty, but the alternative is even uglier.
you know, I've made it clear that I would not agree with that sort of route. I think calls for controls of immigration are certainly allowed, and I do think within reason the right to be able to deport people is also perfectly
Mm,
acceptable.
mm,
And again, I think
mm,
it's you know a lot of people kind of see this as a question of racism or things like that, but you know the reality is if somebody has entered the country, they're not
mm,
keeping to the same laws. People might argue that it's a two-tier justice
mm,
system, but
mm.
you know, it seems fair and right to try and eliminate these issues if people aren't
Okay.
living by the rules of the nation.
Okay.
But
Now, here's a question for you.
mhm,
Imagine your Home Secretary. The security intelligence services come to you and they say, 10 years ago, there were 20,000 Islamists on the terror watch list.
mhm,
Now there are 40,000 on the terror watch list. Next year, or in 5 years' time, we expect there'll be 50,000 on the terror watch list. We're not going to stop all of them getting through. There's going to come a time when there are just too many for us to track them. In other words, the problem is getting worse.
yes.
What would you do to address it? I mean, would you have a free music festival to play "Don't Look Back in Anger"? I mean, what would you do? What would you do?
Yes. I guess to be totally honest, I haven't thought of this as something to write down and put in
Mm,
the script for today. But if you're asking me just off the cuff, and I hope this is not, a wishy-washy kind of answer, but
mhm,
I think quite often with these sorts of issues, we have to explore why these people are acting as such and then put them in some sort of system where you deprogram that sort of
mhm,
ideology. Um,
mhm,
and if then, I guess, a logical kind of response to that would be if they still do not wish to comply with, you know, um, the laws of the land, that they still
mhm,
showcase those radical attitudes,
mhm.
then maybe, jail time or things like that, or deportation. But I
You're
think,
starting to sound like Douglas Carswell.
yes, but you know, the the extent of I'm imagining a kind of Minority Report style, and I hope I'm wrong with this, but a Minority Report style proactive arresting of individuals we have seen throughout history, and I always urge on the side of, I would rather have less state power and less, Windrush Generation 2.0 of deporting people who, you know, we're talking about liberty and individualism here.
Mm.
That's such an infringement on their right to just live a free and happy life. Now, yeah, it would be absurd of me to say, allow individuals who share those contemptible and evil attitudes to kind of exist within this country without question. But I think the proactive idea of mass re-immigration, it just seems, we can't manage so many systems that we have within this country. How would we be able to assure that the right people are
Yeah, totally,
sent
totally. I
away?
mean, totally. I mean, the dysfunction of the British state is such that I doubt they would,
Mm.
when I draft these bills saying that this is what they need to do, I do so knowing that they're so dysfunctional. The idea of them doing so, executing it competently, are very slender indeed. But
Mm.
I agree with all of that. I do think, though, that you know, you said we need to understand why they think.
Yes.
I made an effort to do this about 20 years ago when I read. I was in the House of Commons and I asked the House of Commons Library to get me a copy of a Islamist manifesto by Said Qutb, and it raised a few eyebrows, but they got a copy for me, and I read it. And I mean, I think a lot of people should read it. It's an explanation as to why the world is as it is, in a sort of Muslim version almost of liberation theology. It explains the world in a way that comforts adherence to Islamist ideology,
Mm.
and it sets out a roadmap. So I don't think there's any real mystery as to why Islamists
Yes.
think
Yeah.
they are. It's the influence of people like Qutb. Now, the idea that we can sort of sit people down and say, now look here, I want you to become thoroughly British and eat cucumber sandwiches and be a good old chap, or else I'm going to deport you. I mean, isn't that what Prevent has been trying to do? Charles Farr's program has been trying to do for 15 years. I'm not sure that Prevent is really effective. Maybe rather than Prevent, we need a program called Preempt. And that should say that, if you do subscribe to these following beliefs, such as harm to apostates, we can preemptively remove you.
I mean, I'm very au fait with the writings as well. For my MA, I researched a lot on, ISIS, Al Qaeda, these sorts of organizations.
Mhm.
Um, but I think, the reality is that there is a growing threat. We can't overlook that.
Mhm.
But I think a bigger threat is almost allowing our freedoms to be curtailed. And I know it's an old phraseology, but that's when the terrorists win, is that we allow authoritarianism to reign because of a potential threat. Now, I don't want to diminish the threat, or those incidents when they happen are unforgivable. They're awful. But it just seems for me, and again, this might be another, agree to disagree, but I don't think it's worth the potential price of loss of freedom, the potential price of disrupting an innocent person's life to potentially have as your preempt program would be. I think first of all we have mechanisms in place that I think I remember talking to Bim Afellami, the Conservative MP, and he once explained to me something, and he changed my mind on this. He said quite often people want radical new legislation brought in place, when actually the reality is that we do have a lot of the legislation in place to bring about a lot of the good outcomes. It's just not enforced properly. And so we should ask the relevant authorities. And you've asked questions there about the prevent. but also, maybe in the future, if we do wrestle control of, boat crossings and immigration and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
then it would probably be proper to ask questions then. But we should have a robust system in place to be able to sort that out. And I
Yeah.
think before we start introducing radical measures, maybe we should try and improve the legislation that we have at the moment.
I think you're probably right. I mean, I think there are large swathes of the British state that are incompetent and dysfunctional and just simply can't do
Underutilized
it.
as well,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
It's interesting how people like me who've been in politics or around politics for a long time often think that if you have problem A, the solution is to pass law B to tackle problem A. You have these debates, and I have to say I find them rather fatuous. Should we ban the burqa? Should we? You know, the reason why people want to ban the burqa is not because they object to a particular piece of clothing. It's because there's an underlying problem. So why don't we talk about the underlying problem and not pass a whole series of laws, imagining that banning things is going to make the world a better place?
mm,
Um, I completely get that. And having an administrative state that is dysfunctional means you can pass all the laws you want. They will have all the all the potency of Soviet tractor production targets. You can pass laws declaring whatever. If you don't have a home office that can keep track of people coming in and out, it becomes pointless. So yeah, I think what you say is right. I think simply passing laws is not good enough.
well, what I'd also bring it to is a point that you said earlier, and I'd expand on it as well. Milton Friedman's kind of ideology about permanence of short-term government plans. So if
Mm,
you introduced re-immigration, what would
mm,
happen when, or what would the target be? Where would it stop? It would become one of those things. And again,
yep,
to reiterate the slippery slope, would it expand beyond just
yep,
who you've identified as problemed
yep,
individuals?
yep,
Where would and with a lot of these government schemes, it would self-justify, wouldn't it? It would go, well, we've done a really good job with this, and we've
yep,
sent all these people back. We've been successful with that. We now need to target somebody else. So,
yep.
I guess putting a final point to this, and maybe putting a final point to our first podcast together is, I disagree with that idea.
Mm,
Arguing it from a libertarian standpoint, that
mm,
there's other issues with it as well. But I
mm.
think just even on that
Yeah.
point, I don't think we should tread in those waters. Um,
Yeah. I think your criticism is a very good one. I mean, the libertarian in me does not agree with what the um, Western realist in me says. Absolutely, but that's why I think mass immigration and the free society I want are not compatible. Precisely because you end up having to make a choice. You either build a wall around the garden and it ceases to be a free garden, or the garden gets destroyed.
yeah, well, I think people mostly would argue that putting a wall round, having a robust system to stop,
Mhm.
I don't know, garden thieves from entering the garden, plucking the leaves and whatnot, is a purely sensible idea. But it's kind of going in to the garden, almost
Mm,
self-destructing it itself. That's what I would
mm,
be worried of. You've got the
mm.
most beautiful garden, and with too much government power, I think that
I
is.
think we've taken the gardening metaphor too far,
Yes.
but I take your point. I take your
Yes,
point.
yes, yes. But I guess, that is the end of our first discussion.
Wonderful.
And I would like to invite people to subscribe to the channel.